Welcome, welcome to the Case Downtown legal series. This is one of a number of different opportunities that they've set up as part of this series for the faculty from the law school to come out and engage with the community, talk a little bit about the research we're doing or the projects we're working on, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to let the world at large know what it is we're doing. Obviously, there's the benefit of getting the CLE credit along with it. And I certainly love it as an opportunity to reconnect with alums. It's nice to look out in the crowd and see some familiar faces from students who've taken either the clinic or the lab with me at the law school. So really glad to have everybody here today. A little bit of background about me before I get started. So I've been teaching at Case's Law School for 11 years now. I was at Penn and University of Baltimore teaching before that, and before that was in private practice in New York City. I worked for a couple of law firms there and in a transactional legal practice, represented Wall Street investment banks and dot-com companies and a variety of different privately and publicly held companies, as well as some larger nonprofit institutions. And fast forward now to my time here at Case, and I'm again steeped in a transactional legal practice, but doing it through in our clinical program. I've got a client base of nonprofit and for-profit organizations, mostly sustainable business ventures when I talk about the for-profits, but it's all part of our community development clinic through which we give third-year law students the opportunity to represent clients, to be certified to practice in the clinical setting, to work with supervising attorneys and to get to represent clients during their third year so that when they get out into legal practice, they're that much more comfortable, that much more ready to go. I also co-direct our entire clinical program. We've got 5 different clinics that provide, at this point, more than half of our student body with a clinical opportunity before they graduate. And in the relatively near future, we'll be instituting a requirement that every student who graduates from Case's Law School will either be taking a clinic or an intensive semester-long externship before they graduate, just part of our commitment to experiential education, which from my perspective is all good news. It means I'll continue to be employed there for the foreseeable future. Last couple of years, I've also had a chance to do some research, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today. I wrote an article that was published in the Brooklyn Law Review over the summer called Evaluating Trickle-Down Charity, a Solution for Determining When Economic Development Aimed at Revitalizing America's Cities and Regions is Really Charitable. I do not have a penchant for brief or concise titles for the publications I write, and there's no better evidence really than here. So I retitled it for purposes of today's presentation as Is Economic Development Really Charity? Which I think really gets to the heart of what it was that I was writing about. I should make one clarification at the outset. And let me advance the slide here. There we go. Fantastic. Always great when the technology works. You may certainly get the impression from reading through the article or hearing this presentation that I, for some reason, have it out for nonprofits that engage in economic development work. Nothing could be further than the truth. I love nonprofits that do economic development work. A majority of my client base is made up of clients of nonprofit organizations that do this type of work. So it's not as though I've got some type of special bullseye on these types of organizations. But I do acknowledge and have acknowledged and picked up over my career that they do present a particular type of challenge for the Internal Revenue Service in terms of ensuring that the types of work they're doing, the types of services they provide really further charitable purposes. And it's sort of an inner grappling I've engaged in over the years. I've done this type of work and worked with these types of organizations that's resulted in this paper. I think what's really at issue here, of course, is that as a society, we provide charities with a fairly significant public subsidy. There's a variety of pieces of legislation that ultimately compose this subsidy, and I'll get into detail, a little more detail about that in a few minutes. But if, as we should, we incentivize charitable work through this subsidy, the question really becomes, with respect to each category of organizations that wants 501c3 status, that aspires to it, whether that subsidy is appropriate. And what really at the heart of this paper is considering whether this subsidy is appropriate for what I view as a sort of a new and relatively recent trend of groups forming as regional economic development organizations, or as I refer to them in shorthand as REDOs. So, a starting point for this. And I think one of my favorite features of the article is that it actually started as a result of a clinic case that my first set of students that I worked with at CASE were working on. So this was an organization that prior to my time at CASE, our clinic had helped obtain 501c3 status. So for those of you who are not tax-exempt practitioners, this was an organization that we had set up as an Ohio nonprofit corporation, done its articles, its bylaws, set up its board of directors, and helped it successfully apply for 501c3 status from the Internal Revenue Service. This group was fashioned itself as a think tank for issues that afflicted areas like Cleveland. It wanted to study those issues. It wanted to understand why areas like this were facing some of the challenges that they were, and then ultimately share the results of its research and try to propose some solutions. And so it was a slam dunk as far as 501c3 goes, a group with sort of broad educational purposes, clearly directed towards the achievement of the greater good, a pretty easy case for the IRS to sign off on. Well, move forward a couple of years, my first year there, my first group of students, and the organization came in and said, well, one of the problems we've discovered with areas like Cleveland is that there aren't enough jobs. There are too many people who are unemployed, underemployed, and we need to create more jobs. How do we create more jobs? Well, we need more companies. And how do we attract, cultivate, foster the creation of new companies or bring existing companies here? Well, we need capital. We need money to be able to invest in these companies. And so what we would like to do is we'd like to create an investment pool. We'd like to go out to private investors, folks who are sympathetic to the cause here, but who will probably want a reasonable return on their investment. We'd like to pool together their funds, and then we'd like to strategically invest those funds in businesses that we think have potential to create jobs here in Northeast Ohio. So essentially what we'd like to do is create a venture capital fund. And can we do that as a 501c3 organization? Well, I still remember when the student who had that case brought the case to the rest of the firm whenever our next firm meeting was, and there was an audible scoff in the room from her colleagues as they thought and sort of pointed out that this group didn't look at all like any of the other nonprofits we were working with. They weren't feeding the homeless. They weren't working with folks with a drug addiction. They weren't fighting crime and grime in the neighborhoods that their clients served. They were really proposing something quite different. And so I remember our firm initially approached this with a pretty healthy degree of skepticism. Well, fortunately, the student pushed through her and her colleagues' skepticism and found that there were actually several local examples of groups doing work quite similar to what her client had proposed. And I imagine the names of these organizations are familiar to many of you. Jumpstart, BioEnterprise, Nortec. These are just a couple examples of a number of groups locally that started around that time, really came to the forefront in the early part of the first decade of the century. And their real mission was to provide assistance to for-profit businesses so that they could ultimately create jobs for this region. A couple years later, I set a couple of my urban development lab students out on, oh man, am I not pointing this in the right direction? Let's see. I'm sorry, I might have a dead clicker here, excuse me. or I'm just that incompetent when it comes to technology, which is a real possibility here. Yeah.
It's odd that it worked the first time through.
I think I just lack the touch.
Push the arrow right there.
Push the arrow. Focus on the arrow. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I really wish I could blame it on that. Okay, so I sent a group of students out on looking to see whether this was something that was happening beyond just Northeast Ohio. And as a matter of fact, it was. We found that there were groups like this, the groups that we termed REDOs, Regional Economic Development Organizations, sprouting up all over the country. Ann Arbor Spark in Michigan, Bio Crossroads in Indianapolis, Invest Nebraska Corporation covering the entire state of Nebraska, Biogenerator in St. Louis, Propel iBio Institute in Illinois. In fact, when we looked at the 50 largest metropolitan statistical areas, we found that every one of those areas had, within the last 10 or 15 years or so, either started an organization like this or an organization that had been longstanding, had really risen to prominence, and had become a vital part of regional economic development strategies in each of those areas. So what we had was an honest-to-goodness trend. Uh-oh. Come back here. Sorry, do you mind bringing us back about five? Oh, maybe about five or six more pages. You've got to go back actually 12 pages. That's okay. Bear with us for a second. We'll get back on track. Okay, actually, one forward one. Okay, if it's not working, do you mind if I just call out to you? Thanks a lot. Okay, so what we identified was that this was part of an emerging trend, a new category of organizations. What distinguished this group of organizations, they're nonprofit groups primarily, and one's almost always seeking 501c3 status, established to promote place-based economic development within a large, demographically diverse geographic area. And this really was what set them apart from economic development practiced by charities in the past. There were groups in the 1960s and 70s that were set up as charities, did economic development group in the areas they served, but they tended to be located in highly distressed, fairly narrowly confined urban neighborhoods. What's different about these groups, the REDOs, is that they're working in much larger, their service areas are much larger. They tend to spread across an entire region, or in the case of that Nebraska group, an entire state. And they're working within areas that are demographically diverse. So sure, there are pockets of poverty within those areas, but there's also areas, pockets of affluence, and certainly plenty of areas that are somewhere in between poor and affluent. And so much broader geographic scope to the service area these groups were serving. They were primarily operating by directly aiding for-profit businesses in any of a number of different ways. Some were making equity investments, making loans to for-profit businesses. Some were providing incubator space, laboratory space. Others were providing technical assistance, business plan consulting, how to attract talent, employment talent, marketing assistance. And finally, these groups are independent of the government. That's not to say that they don't receive some funding from government. That's not to say that they don't have board members who may be government officials, but when you think in terms of corporate separateness, these groups are not arms or auxiliaries of federal, state, or local government. They're freestanding, independent, nonprofit organizations. So taken together, these characteristics is really what I have in mind when I'm talking about REDOs. You oftentimes also hear them referred to as business accelerators. Okay, I'm going to try to advance this one. Could you bring it? There we go, thanks. So that's sort of the factual analysis. Where's the legal issue here, and what's the legal problem or the legal question? And I come back to that question of whether that large public subsidy that we as a society direct towards charities because we want to encourage charitable work is appropriate for this type of organization. And let me just give you briefly a sense of what I'm talking about when I say large public subsidy. So we've got an income tax exemption for organizations that successfully qualify under Section 501c3. The statute 501c3 provides them with federal income tax exemption, but almost always state and local tax exemption follow from recognition as a 501c3. These groups are able to qualify to receive tax-deductible contributions from businesses and individuals. So I imagine you either complete your own 1040s or you have your accountants do it, and there's an amount that you contribute to charity each year, or may or may not contribute to charity each year, and that amount can be deducted from your adjusted gross income. And that's something ultimately we as a society subsidize, in the sense that the tax revenue foregone from the amount that you're able to deduct from your taxable income has to be made up somewhere else. These groups are eligible for government and foundation dollars that most other nonprofit organizations are not eligible for by virtue of their 501c3 status. There are a myriad of federal, state, and local statutes that provide regulatory exemptions and other types of tax exemptions and fee exemptions for 501c3s. And then finally, there's just that societal goodwill, that sense that an organization has been scrutinized by the Internal Revenue Service, has been given 501c3 status, and I think the public at large is more apt to work with, donate, devote resources to organizations that have that status. So when I say large public subsidy, that's really what I'm talking about, the accumulation of all of those different benefits. So again, then back to the question, should redos qualify for this exemption, which is really a policy question, but one that's backed up by some legal standards. There we go, thanks. To qualify under 501c3, an organization has to demonstrate that it meets the organizational and operational tests of 501c3. In other words, it must show that it is organized for and will be operated exclusively in furtherance of charitable purposes. I use charitable as shorthand here for educational, religious, scientific, some of the other tags that are associated with 501c3 status, just for simplicity's sake and because there is a fair amount of overlap in their definitions. But at the forefront, an organization has to be able to demonstrate that it will further charitable purposes exclusively. And I think an interesting offshoot of that that is particularly apt for economic development organizations is that these organizations must pass what's known as the private benefit doctrine. That comes out of a Treasury Department regulation that interprets 501c3. And the private benefit doctrine says literally an organization does not operate exclusively for exempt purposes if it serves a private interest rather than a public interest. So if you were to apply it literally, it would say that the activities of a 501c3 cannot further private interests. It can only further public interests. The IRS over time has recognized that it's pretty much impossible to fully divorce the satisfaction of private interests from the satisfaction of public interests. And so they've interpreted this test to mean that any private benefit created by a charity's activities must be incidental to the public benefit it creates. And the IRS views the word incidental as having both a qualitative and a quantitative side. It must be qualitatively incidental in the sense that any benefit, any private benefit that results from the organization's activities must be a necessary result of achieving the public benefit. The private benefit cannot, the public benefit cannot take place without benefiting those private interests. And it must also be quantitatively incidental in the sense that the private benefit must be small relative to the public benefit that results from the organization's activities. Now, I realize it's before 9. These concepts are a little abstract, so let me flesh it out a little bit here with an example. So let's imagine a group that wants to form an after-school program to work with at-risk children in a low-income neighborhood. And to run that program, the organization is going to need to have staff, probably teachers, administrative staff to help administer the program. It's going to need to have computers, athletic equipment, books, school supplies, different things for the kids to be able to work on while they're at the program. Very well also may need to rent space in a building. It's going to need to hold the activity somewhere. So you've got staff that's paid, you've got Target and Dick's Sporting Goods that are shopped at, you've got a private landlord who's maybe receiving rent payments. All of these are examples of private benefit that result from accomplishing the public benefit that the organization aspires to create. And the IRS, in looking at a situation like this, would almost certainly find that it's qualitatively incidental, that private benefit, because you really can't run the program without space and without staff and without supplies, and that it's quantitatively incidental because when you really think about it, when you step back and consider it, the benefit that's going to those private parties is relatively speaking smaller than the public benefit that's achieved. How I've just described it is actually the way the IRS applies the private benefit doctrine. It's that intuitive, it's that ad hoc. With most types of nonprofit organizations, they ask questions occasionally about the doctrine when the organization's applying for C3 status. There's some questions in the 1023 application that elicit this type of information. But at the end of the day, for most categories of 501c3s, we're really left with the gut reaction of the exempt organization agent who reviews the 1023. And historically, that really hadn't been much of a problem, really up until the late 1980s. Most of the groups that aspired to be charities were involved in conventional charitable work. The private benefit doctrine rarely became an issue. That started to change in the late 1980s, and I think that's particularly, the private benefit doctrine is particularly implicated here in the case of redos. And why is that? So redos are providing their services not directly to members of a charitable class, they're providing them to for-profit businesses. Those are the direct, immediate recipients of the services. They're the ones receiving the capital infusions, the space, the technical assistance. And in that sense, we're really flipping the traditional model of charitable services delivery on its head. Rather than providing services directly to members of a charitable class and wondering if the private benefit that follows from it is truly incidental, we're instead providing the services directly to for-profit businesses and hoping that there's enough public benefit to justify that upfront provision. And so in my mind, the public benefit is really incidental to the provision of the private benefit. Not only is it incidental, but it's speculative. What do I mean by that? So let's imagine we're here in the Cleveland area and we've got a local redo, and it's looking for some businesses to make investments in, and it's probably looking out to Westlake or Beechwood or Hudson or some other hotbed of entrepreneurial activity here locally, and it makes an investment in one of those companies, and it's hoping, first off, that it ultimately succeeds. Certainly not a given when it comes to small businesses, as any of you who work with small businesses know. Plenty of businesses with good ideas that never are able to really get off the ground. That if the business succeeds, it stays local. Again, recent past suggests that that's not a given. Companies get to a certain stage and Silicon Valley, Boston, sometimes even Buffalo, to cite to a relatively recent example here locally, for any number of reasons, begins to appear more attractive to the company. Maybe their next round of investment requires that they move to that area. Maybe the particular talent base that they're looking for is located in that area, and they're having a harder time finding it locally. So now we're assuming it becomes successful. We're assuming it stays local, and if what we're really trying to accomplish is charitable purposes and the service of a charitable class, we're assuming that ultimately it's going to create the types of jobs that are going to be available to those who are unemployed and underemployed. So we may not be talking about the sort of advanced technology positions within some of the targets of redos. We're talking about folks that are laid off and have had a difficult time finding a job and might be needing to find positions that require a lower skill set. This all sort of feeds into this critique and this notion that as practiced by redos, what we're really talking about is trickle-down charity. Benefits provided up top to the businesses, and the hope is that eventually the benefits are able to trickle down to the public at large or to those particular members of a charitable class that we have in mind. So does this type of activity satisfy the private benefit doctrine? So the jurisprudence on this issue is not particularly well crafted. There is some suggestion in the IRS materials that review nonprofits doing charitable work that there needs to be a nexus between the assistance that's being provided and the businesses that are being served and the needs of the community, the particular aspects of economic distress that this organization is trying to serve. There's some statement in some of the IRS interpretive materials that suggests that simply promoting business within a community is not enough. It's got to be more targeted than that. These are the principles that are set out in some of the IRS administrative materials, but I can tell you simply from observing which groups are receiving 501c3 status these days and by reference to some private letter rulings from the last 10 or 15 years or so, the IRS's use of this test tends to ebb and flow based on the particular type of organization it seems to be reviewing. There are some instances where the IRS makes absolutely no mention of the private benefit doctrine when evaluating an economic development group that seeks C3 status. There's other instances in which they use it, and they use it to dismiss the organization's application, but trying to square the IRS's approach one ruling to another is pretty difficult to do. So my critique of the jurisprudence is that it's outdated. It's based primarily on the only precedential law that the IRS utilizes are 3 revenue rulings from the 1970s. Those revenue rulings were written in a time, again, when most economic development done by charities was focused on these highly distressed neighborhoods. And so they sort of worked for that time. But when we talk about 21st century economic development done by charities, they're just too far out of date. They're intuitively and inconsistently applied. As I mentioned, when you look through the rulings, the private letter rulings, the other examples you're able to find of how the IRS treats these organizations, you really do get that sense of the gut reaction of the agent who's reviewing the application and not any type of a sort of careful, methodical approach to reviewing them. And then finally, I would say the process is quite mistimed. As anybody who works with nonprofit organizations know and has worked on a 1023 application, there's a fair amount of scrutiny up front, right? The organization fills out the 1023 and the IRS reviews it and it asks some questions. There's some back and forth between the IRS and the agency in many cases. But once it's got 501c3 status, the IRS rarely comes back and reassesses the underlying foundational basis for the organization's charitable status. Now, it may, through the course of submitting its annual reports, its annual 990s, it may trigger IRS scrutiny for another reason because it's compensating its chief executive excessively, or there's too many insider transactions, or it engages in too much lobbying. But the IRS's focus really turns to hot button issues once the organization has C3 status. I think the problem is that with groups like Redos, you really need a track record in order to be able to effectively evaluate whether the types of businesses they're aiding and the types of jobs they're trying to create actually line up with charitable purposes. You really need to see it in action, and you really don't, because they're scrutinized during that first year or two of their existence when they really aren't fully operational. And then the subsequent 990 annual reports ask precious little questions about, so how exactly are you accomplishing your exempt purposes? Show us exactly through your activities how you're achieving what you've set out to do. There we go. So end result, Redos are not evaluated in a consistent and meaningful way on the very issue on which their 501c3 qualification should turn, the private benefit doctrine. I guess it's fair at this point or at any point to say, so what? So what's the, you know, what's the real world impact here of the IRS taking this type of an approach to these types of organizations? Yeah, I think my principal concern has to do with a diversion of charitable funds, that when we talk about this large public subsidy and the Internal Revenue Service being the steward of that subsidy, to the extent that its review or its analysis of a particular category of organizations is not careful enough, we risk misusing and wasting the subsidy. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but just
Yeah.
on that point, do you
Sure.
have a sense of the aggregate revenue loss from redos?
You know, I can't give you an sort of a total figure. I think what I found that was most interesting was a study that the Foundation Center here in Cleveland spearheaded about 5 years ago that was able to show that when you compared charitable giving by foundations in 2005 as compared to 2011, I think. No, 2005 to 2008. As you looked at it as sort of a pie, the portion of the pie that was going to economic development increased significantly, and the portion of the pie that went to everything else shrank a bit. Now, of course, the overall aggregate amount of money that foundations were sending to various types of charitable purposes grew. There was more charitable giving than there had in 2008 than there had been in 2005. But as a percentage, the amount that was going to economic development was increasing. And I think, you know, I don't have necessarily a very specific background in working with foundations, but I know enough to know that there's a limit for most foundations on how much they'll spend in a particular year. They need to preserve the assets of the entity, and so most will restrict their spending to a certain percentage. And so if we think of the amount of foundation money that's available as finite, and there's an increase in the amount going to economic development, I think that comes at the cost of other types of charitable purposes. Sure. I think there also ought to be a concern about the creation of an unmerited competitive advantage for businesses that are aided by redos. So if you've got business A and business B and they're located in the same region and otherwise they kind of look roughly the same, and business A has additional access to capital, is getting low-cost incubator space, is getting free technical assistance, it's got a leg up relative to business B. And that's all well and good if the redos investment policies and strategy are closely tied to the accomplishment of charitable purposes. If it's too loose, I think you've got one business succeeding to the detriment of another. And then I think finally there ought to be a concern at any time there's imprecision in the spending of the charitable subsidy, that the society at large takes a look at the nonprofit sector and says it's really not, it's not quite as charitable as we perceived it to be. And so what I spend a fair amount of time in the article exploring is, are there other ways to regulate redos and to more carefully tailor the private benefit doctrine to these types of organizations, identify a wide range of alternatives. One approach might be to require that the boards of directors of those organizations consist of a certain number of individuals from the distressed areas that fall within that reduced service area. And by having enough on board leadership that have an orientation towards distressed communities, you may be able to affect the policies and ensure that they stay true to charitable purposes. Another approach might be to have each individual board member certify each year as part of the 990 that they believe that the types of businesses they're providing aid to and assistance to further charitable purposes. Certainly another approach, and one that I think is essential, is to get those 1970s era revenue rulings updated, bring them into the 21st century, make them more nuanced, recognize exactly how economic development has changed in the past 40 years. Another approach would be more extensive reporting and disclosure requirements. So the annual 990, for any of you, and I know there's a fair number of you here who work with nonprofit organizations, you know that the 990 asks a lot of general questions, and then for certain industries or groups of nonprofits, there are industry-specific schedules that go onto the back of the 990 that really get at some of the regulatory challenges associated with that particular category of nonprofit. So schools, hospitals, credit counseling organizations, just to name a few. We might consider a schedule that's targeted towards economic development organizations that ask questions like, which businesses did you serve this year, and how many jobs did you create, and what types of jobs did you create, as a way of on an ongoing basis, ensuring the group is creating the type of economic activity that it ought to. And then another approach would be for the IRS to take a greater role in monitoring redos, stepping in to reevaluate the basis for their 501c3 status, not unlike the IRS has chosen to do with hospitals, where now every 3 years hospitals are being reevaluated by the Internal Revenue Service. In the course of coming up with choosing from among these options, of course, you've got to establish some priorities, those things that seem to be the most important. So do you mind hitting the down arrow? Thank you. And among those that I viewed as high priority in the article, analytic depth and consistency. Of course, as much of what I've spoken about up to this point suggests that I think the IRS ought to be observing these organizations more carefully, ought to be adopting more nuanced standards in evaluating them. Consistency, I think if the private benefit doctrine is going to be applied for one organization that does economic development work, it really ought to be applied for all of them. Flexibility, at the same time, we've got to recognize that economic development in downtown Cleveland looks different than economic development in rural Texas. I wouldn't want to see standards adopted that suggested a one-size-fits-all. This is the only way you do charitable economic development, because I think it would miss. I think it would oversimplify. Accountability. This notion of you're not just being reviewed when you initially apply for C3 status, but there's some type of ongoing way in which we can evaluate the work it is that you're doing. And then finally, I think critical is sensitivity to regulatory resources. And this is always an issue, I think, with law review articles and with things that we tend to propose, which is to tend to want to propose a government fix. Of course, if the IRS came in every year and reevaluated every organization that does charitable economic development group, we'd probably have an uptick in compliance and a greater degree of assurance that these organizations are accomplishing charitable purposes. But the IRS is already strapped for resources, and the likelihood of there being a significant increase in devotion of resources to scrutinizing these types of organizations, I think is quite small, and I think I've got to be realistic about that. So what do I propose? Okay, could you catch me one more time with it? There we go. I'd suggest that when groups that are economic development organizations that aspire to C3 status apply for 501c3, they ought to have to submit a community economic hardship assessment. I've cribbed this idea from the IRS's regulation of hospitals. They're requiring statements like this from hospitals when they apply for 501c3 status. They should actually include some indication of what types of distress the region that they're planning to serve is suffering from, and that should be backed up by good credible evidence, either a government finding or the conclusion of some type of credible third party, and that should be accompanied by an action plan. So here's the type of distress this area is facing. Here specifically is what we plan to do. Here are the types of businesses we plan to invest in. Here's our long-term strategy, and here's how it links up with this hardship assessment. That should be submitted by all organizations that aspire to do economic development to any significant degree. If we're talking about it as a very small program of a neighborhood improvement organization, I don't think that's quite what we have in mind here. We're talking about groups that are principally devoted to economic development. I would call for a schedule on the annual Form 990 to elicit that type of additional detailed information that I think would be useful for donors and the public at large to know about as relates to a group that aspires to do economic development work. And I'd also call for it to be reviewed periodically by the IRS. This is the tough one, again, I think because of the resource question. Where I might strike a balance is to suggest that the IRS shouldn't be held to a fixed period of time, like every 3 years or every 5 years as it is with the hospitals. I think it should be done on a rolling basis as resources permit. But my sense is that because these groups would know that at some point the IRS was going to come back and review the basis for their 501c3 status, that would be enough to sort of orient them on an ongoing basis to this need to satisfy charitable purposes. It wouldn't just be, they wouldn't think that now that we've gotten through the 1023 approval, we're pretty much done for unless we commit some awful act. Just knowing that at some point a review is looming, I think would be useful. And of course, the IRS's job would be made easier by the requirement that the groups have to submit the schedule to the Form 990 each year. So when the IRS would step in and look at a group after 5 years, they'd have 5 years worth of data that would be included on the schedules to the 990. And it might be that the IRS doesn't even need to contact the organization. It can just sift through those schedules and content itself. In those cases where it saw issues, it would have to reach out and push a little further. Could you bring me back one? Or two, actually. Okay. It's the last slide where I just provided kind of a big picture perspective. And again, it's quite easy to draw an impression from this that I somehow have it out for economic development groups that do this type of work. To the contrary, I think they're making a fantastic impact in some places that really need it. I think Cleveland's a great example of that. But when you look at the proliferation of these organizations in areas large and small, areas poor, rich, somewhere in between, where you see that they're serving areas that include some pockets of distress, but oftentimes include lots of areas that aren't distressed. My real concern is trying to ensure that when they're working in a particular area, that they're ensuring that the types of businesses that they're aiding are actually going to the areas that need it most. And I think the private benefit doctrine, which for a long time was fairly unnoticed, was underutilized by the Internal Revenue Service. I shouldn't say unutilized, because it really didn't need to be utilized. It wasn't so germane to charities of yesteryear. What's changing in the 21st century is that the nonprofit sector is more commercial, more entrepreneurial. Its aspirations, its ambitions are broader, and that's a great thing. I think it shows confidence in that sector to be able to do more. At the same time, we shouldn't lose sight of some of the critical doctrines that underlie 501c3 status. I think the private benefit doctrine in this case would be a good one to resuscitate and enliven so that we can effectively regulate these types of organizations. The article, for anybody who chooses to absorb it in all 70 pages, is out there in hard copy. There was also a link in the advertisements in the advertisement for this program to a free download of the article, which if any of you go ahead and find it and read it and review it, I'd be thrilled to get any thoughts or comments you have on it. And I think we have about 15 minutes or so remaining here. I'd be happy to entertain any questions or hear what folks have to say about this.
Thank you for the presentation. In terms of your comment regarding board composition for these organizations, yes. I think that provides a very insightful guidance. Could you comment upon execution, what next steps or suggestions would be to bring that into reality?
Yes, so you would need either a change to 501 of the Internal Revenue Code, like what was done for credit counseling and debt management organizations. That was another group of aspiring 501c3s that Congress and the IRS looked at and said, boy, there's significant risk here that there's going to be more private benefit than public benefit. And so they added, I believe it's 501Q of the Internal Revenue Code, which requires that the composition of the board of directors be reflective of the communities that they serve. It might even have a fixed requirement in there that a majority of the directors come from the communities served, as a way of sort of ensuring the right balance on the board. So I would think that we'd probably be talking about an amendment to 501, because I don't think the IRS can unilaterally step in and require a change in board composition. Yes.
A best practices interactive relationship with the communities that one
Sure.
serves, even on a broad basis. I would hope that there would be
Sure.
more, shall we say, intelligence and sensitivity, because I don't know if your article covers this, but as you know, several of these organizations, even in this region, have had to remorph, reform. Some have drifted away. So perhaps a composition review, shall we say, could strengthen them for sustainability going forward. What would be your view on that? I would hope that we would not have to go through the rigor of federal regulation for what seems to be a smart operation.
No, that's a fantastic point, and that would be essentially the organizations themselves taking it upon themselves to make these changes. I mean, on a practical level, it would be fantastic if groups did that. It'd be hard to assure ourselves that would happen, but I think the path would be through the foundations and city government. It's all about the money, right? It's where the funding comes from. It would be funders that I think would have that impact on legislative impact on these organizations. Sure.
I have two concerns. First of all, regarding the proposed requirement for the plan or whatever that you suggested, it seems to me like the economic development would be a whole new set of consultants that not-for-profits have to pay for, like grant writers, to make sure that what they're submitting sounds good. So I'm not sure that actually helps anybody. And on a more practical level, over the last 25 years, I've sat on a number of economic development boards, local ones, and it seems like the ultimate problem is the more local the focus and the more local the board, the more likelihood of political pressure, local business pressure. In other words, the local bigwigs, even though in the great scheme of things they may look small, bear a lot of power locally and therefore can influence the board to give monies where it may not necessarily be best used. So by suggesting that there be a more local involvement of a board, you may actually be doing yourself a disfavor because that actually creates more local favoritism. And what it seems to me you need is to actually step back and have people who are completely disinterested from the economic local development, but have some sort of expertise who can provide a more objective view of board management and decisions.
No, those are some really interesting points. As it turns out in the article, I actually stepped back from the requirement about board composition and focused on some of the other strategies. Not because I thought the board composition was a lost cause or not a good idea, but when you think about the various considerations and the fact that you can't do everything, I thought some of the other solutions were more likely to be effective, and maybe that is in part in line with your point. I think you probably still, though, could. I guess this wouldn't be a suggestion that the board consist entirely of people from, of local folks. I think it would more be that in choosing local folks, you be aware of where they're coming from and what areas of the region served they're coming from. I think you're right that it helps to have a diversity of perspectives on the board, and to have some folks that are completely detached from local politics would be quite vital to the success of an organization like this. But there's a balance of perspectives you want on any board of directors, of course. And I think it would more be a call for these organizations to be careful about who the local players are that they bring onto the board. And as for the first point, I mean, yeah, certainly there's a possibility that that sort of imposes an additional cost on these organizations. But I guess with any additional obligation, there's a cost-benefit analysis. What's the benefit we gain from requiring them to be more extensive in what they say? I guess I would think in this situation, without actually having seen it implemented yet, so not having a full sense of what the cost would be, that I think the benefit would outweigh the cost. But good points, thank you. Hey, Ted.
Maybe just a comment. I think here locally, particularly the groups you showed initially, they do very different things.
Right.
And so some have a stated objective of attracting capital, some creating jobs, usually around a focused industry area. And those are second-tier organizations that are usually funded by our sort of bigger players, the Cleveland Foundation or the Fund for Economic Future, who really do hold them accountable to those metrics and will, frankly, change their funding and availability of funding if they don't hit the numbers. I don't know how pervasive that is, that there is an internal accountability, but I do know that particularly some of the 1023s that I've worked on for similar organizations over the last few years, those metrics are all stated to the IRS up front. I mean, they're presented. It could be N number of interns are going to be going to have experiences with startup companies, so there's an educational purpose, or jobs will be created in a needed industry sector because, as a Rust Belt economy, we may not be as far ahead in technology as we should. So I think there are scraps of accountability built into the process that could be utilized. But I agree with you that, once you're over the hump, once you sort of get waved in, nobody ever goes back and says, did you really do what you said you were going to do? Did you follow the strategy that you laid out? Personally, I think that could be very useful and not that difficult if you could quantify what it is the outcomes were and then report back on whether or not you achieved them. Because many of them fall right within the code. You have to go around the bend with economic development because it's not a purpose unto itself. But again, no revisitation.
No, I have to say that local groups got a disproportionate amount of attention, not only in this presentation but also in the article. In part because I'm here, and that's sort of where we. For an audience like this, of course, it helps to draw on local examples. I actually have to say, relative to things I've seen in other areas of the country, I think the redos based in Cleveland do a better job, and I think have a higher degree of accountability, in part because of, I think because of the approach taken by the funders. I think it's fairly clear when you look at Jumpstart's annual report, when you look at the way some of these organizations come back and report out on their activities, that there is, sort of separate and apart from the Internal Revenue Service, some type of more informal regulation taking place. I contrast that with some of the things I saw in other areas of the country. There's a group out of Phoenix who's, I'm still wondering how they got through the Internal Revenue Service initially, and on their annual 990, when it says, how have you accomplished your exempt purposes in the last year, it essentially says, we created jobs. That's it. It's one line, and it's trying to reconcile. I think while my starting point was here locally, what I found is I actually think we do quite well relative to most areas, and I also think the case for distress locally is much stronger. Rust Belt cities are really fit within the profile, I think, of organizations that the IRS had or that the law has had in mind all along. These are sort of the distressed neighborhoods of the 60s and 70s stretched out over a much wider area. But there are areas of the country where you find only traces of the poverty that we have here that are essentially operating in exactly the same way that groups are doing locally, but without that sense of accountability.
Case studies are actually here locally. Nationally, they're really a center for best practices. Maybe another comment is the Economic Development Administration is obviously a player with most of the large organizations here, and they're much more rigorous in assessing the health of the community, the potential for impact. There's a lot more back and forth, and frankly, the money's harder to get than a 501c3 status is. There could be some potentially useful interplay between the EDA's role in the community and what the IRS is reviewing here.
Great. No, thank you. Thanks. I see we're almost to 9:30. Any final thoughts or questions, or should we wrap it up? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming out, and certainly the comments were great.